So now that we learned about the number and string data type, let's talk about the Boolean data type. So in my humble opinion, the Boolean data type is really the simplest data type there is because it only has two possible values. Really, the Boolean data type only sounds complicated because it's named after someone, right? George Boole. But when it comes to the possible values, there are only two, right? Just true and false. So I'll just console.log these. And notice that I'm not wrapping up these true and false in quotes because it's actually a value in itself, right? So let's run this code. Nothing too breathtaking here, just printing out true and false. But of course, let's focus on what operations we can do utilizing Booleans, right? So right now, I'll just focus on this true value, right? This Boolean value it is. And what I can do is use an operation to kind of flip the Boolean value. So instead of true, if I say exclamation point true, the way I actually pronounce or read this operator is by saying not, right? So it's a not operator. So what is not true? Well, that is just false, right? Nothing too fancy there. And then what is not false? Well, that's just true. And you can apply this as many times as you want, right? You can say like not false, which is going to give you a false, right? Just evaluating in pieces. And that's because JavaScript, again, just evaluates in parts, right? So when I see this, slightly complicated expression, I can highlight this part of the expression. So what is not false? Well, that's true. And then what is not true? Well, that's back to just false, right? So just flipping back and forth, giving us a final evaluation of just a false over here. Something important to note about like the not operation for Booleans is that it works on a single value at a time, right? So you just say you're applying not to a single false. What you don't do is like not two things together, right? So something that would be invalid is to say like this, like true, not false. That's not even valid, right? You can see my VS Code already complain, right? So when you use not, you apply it to a single value at a time. There's another nice operation you can use with Booleans, and we call it the AND operation. And the AND operation is interesting because it actually utilizes two Boolean values, right? It kind of combines them into a single one. So in other words, what I can say is false and false, and we'll see what that evaluates to. Notice that to represent the AND operation, I use double ampersand to do that. And when I run this code, we're gonna see false printed out, and that by itself doesn't add too much clarity, right? We don't really know in general what the AND operation does, but I'll tell you what, since the Boolean data type only has two possible values, I can write every possibility for using AND, right? I know there are gonna be only 4 total possibilities for how I can use AND. So I'll lay them out over here. So these are all 4 combinations of Booleans we can use with the AND operation. Let's see if there's any pattern to it, right? So I'll give this a run. I notice I only get back a single true. The only time I got back true was when both sides of the AND was true. And here you can kind of reason out what the AND operation represents, right? It's saying the left side must be true and the right side should be true. So even if only just like one of the sides is true, that's not good enough because we need both sides to be true, right? So the pattern for an AND operation is it only returns true when both sides are true. So you may hear AND referred to as like a logical operation because it establishes logic in our code. So in like the practical sense, like what can we do in the long run eventually with the AND operation? Well, you can express logic. So we know that AND only evaluates to true when both sides are true, and that is really in line with how we use the word AND in like the English vocabulary sense, right? In other words, in English, if I said that my name is Alvin and I am a programmer, you'd probably respond by saying, oh, that is a true statement, right? Because both of these things is true. However, if I said that my name is Alvin and I am a professional basketball player, you would say that that statement is false because if you're saying and, both things would have to be true, right? For the entire statement, the entire expression to evaluate to true, right? So although and is probably not an operation that you think about a lot, it's basically exactly how you use the word in English. So that was and. Let's see a similar pattern for Booleans, and we call it the OR operation. And so to use the OR operation, what we're going to need to do is use double pipes instead of double ampersands. So to type the pipe symbol, what you're going to need to do is hit that other character that's on the backslash key. So what you can do is hold shift and hit backslash, and I'll give you a pipe. I need 2 of those, and we call that operation the logical OR operation, right? And so we know that these 4 expressions are all possible ways we can write an OR. So when I run this code, let's see what happens. Notice that I kind of just see like the opposite pattern compared to what I said with and, right? So what's a trick I can use to memorize the OR operation? Well, the OR operation just will return true if at least one of your sides is true, right? So in these 2 scenarios, at least one of my sides is true, but even if both sides are true, the total expression evaluates to true. Kind of in the opposite flow, the only way you can get a false back when you do an OR is when both sides are false, right? So that actually describes all of the operations that we can do with Booleans, right? There are only three. You can do not, and or, but what you could also do is combine them if you wanted to, right? So let's say I had an expression like this, where I said true or not false, right? You know that when you evaluate an expression, you evaluate in pieces, so you just evaluate this right-hand side first, so not false, will evaluate to true, then you're just saying true or true, which you know the entire thing evaluates to a true, right? So it's up to you in how you want to combine these operations. Final thing I want to note about Boolean expressions is a little gotcha. And so when I have an expression like this, you see that it has two operations in it, right? It has an and an or. There is actually an order of operations for Booleans, right? In general, the and operation has a higher precedence than or, right? So technically when you see this expression, this left-hand side, or like the false and false, evaluates first, which gives me false, right? And then from here, false or true will give me a true as my final answer. So this expression over here will give me a true, but if I force the order of operations with parentheses, and let's say I really want to perform the or first, you would actually get a different result, right? So this one is true, but the second one down here would evaluate to false, because in the second expression, I have to evaluate the or first, which means false or true evaluates to true. And then we're saying false and true, which overall evaluates to false, right? Because we were doing an and over there. So notice how the parentheses actually affect this expression. The key takeaway here is, by default, the and operation has higher precedence than or. So the next thing I want to show you in this lecture is how I can perform comparisons in JavaScript. So bearing in mind that we just learned about Booleans, what's really important about a comparison is that it actually results in a Boolean. So let's say I write my first comparison over here. One of the comparisons I can do is just check for equality. In other words, I can check, hey, is 42 equal to 42? And so notice that to represent equality, right now I'm using the triple equals operator, so it's just three equal signs. So when I run this code, I'm going to see the result of the expression. And in this case, this expression evaluates to true, right? Because 42 is equal to 42. Of course, I can change things around a bit. So I can check if 42 is equal to 43. That, of course, is a false statement, right? So to check for equality, we want to use triple equals in JavaScript. Along with that, there's also a way to check for not equal to. So what I can do is, instead of writing three equal signs, I can say not and then double equal sign. And this checks is 42 not equal to 43, which is now a true statement. And of course, you can anticipate how this operator behaves, right? So I can check for equality or a non-equality. What you could also do is compare values relative to each other using things like a greater than and less than, right? So for example, I can check is 43 greater than 2? That's a true statement, right? Is 43 less than 2? That's a false statement. You can also check for less than or equal to or greater than or equal to, right? So if I wanted to, I can check, hey, is 43 less than or equal to 43? That is a true statement. Then I can also check, is 43 less than or equal to 40? That's going to be a false statement, right? So I'll give that a run. So here I have listed all of the types of comparisons we can perform in JavaScript, right? We have equality, not equality, less than, greater than, less than or equal to, and also greater than or equal to. When it comes to using these comparisons, you don't have to just compare using numeric values. You can also do that using strings, right? So I can check console.log, is the string apple equal to the string apple? When I run that code, that is a true statement. Of course, I can switch things up. I can check if lowercase apple is equal to apple with a capital A. That would give me a false result. What's also pretty cool about JavaScript is you can use less than and greater than with strings as well. So for example, if I switch this up, let me check if cat is less than dog. And that returns me some values, right? So I get back true. And just from that single example alone, it's not really evident what exactly less than for strings evaluates to. Let me write a few other examples. I also know that cat is less than caterpillar, right? So we can check that. That's also true. But something not true would be like cat less than apple. So looking at these examples, how can we predict less than and greater than for string data? Well, what less than and greater than do is really just compare the relative order of these strings or these words as if they would be in the alphabet, right? Like in a dictionary. In other words, cat is less than dog because cat would appear earlier in the dictionary, right? Cat has an earlier alphabetical order. Something else to note about these strings is what happens when I have strings that are kind of substrings of one another. In other words, if I had cat versus caterpillar, although one of my words is like a prefix of one of my other words, technically the shorter word would appear first in the dictionary, right? So that still holds true. So last bit I want to talk about is another way to perform an equality check. And I think as a general rule of thumb, in most cases and as a best practice, you will want to use triple equals to check for equality, but there also exists a double equals in JavaScript. And so if there are two different operators to perform equality in JavaScript, what's really the difference between them? So triple equals performs what I call a strict equality, and then a double equals performs a loose equality. And so let's just write a few examples and kind of see what that means in a practical sense. So let's say console.log a message, and let's just start with comparing two of the same values using triple equals and then double equals, right? So I'm going to check is 42 triple equal to 42. Then I'm also going to print out is 42 double equals to 42. And so when I run this code, both of these statements are true, right? So in general, we have the sense that strict equality and loose equality kind of perform the same thing, right? Asking whether or not both of the sides of my expression are in fact equal. However, if I have a loose equality, what JavaScript will do is actually try to compare my two values even across types. In other words, I can compare the number 42 to the string containing the characters 42. Right, so let's actually try that example for both of our operators. When I run this code, so looking at the strict equality, that is the triple equals, it looks like when I check is the number 42 equal to the string 42, I actually get back false. But in the second example, when I use the loose equality, the double equals, it does tell me true that, hey, the number 42 is equal to the string containing the characters 42. In other words, what does the loose equality do? Well, it's going to be able to match my values even across data types. So like I said, in most scenarios, you'll want to probably prefer the strict equality, right? When you're checking for equal values, you're probably also assuming that they are going to be the same type, right? But it's also good to just have some awareness for this special operator in JavaScript. If anything, it's just some fun JavaScript trivia. All right, programmers, so that's all I had planned for this video lecture. In the very next video, we're going to actually have an exercise. Like I always say, if you actually want to get better as a programmer, then you have to actually write some programs and read some programs, right? So simply just watching these video lectures will not make you a better programmer. Hopefully you were following along and coding for yourself, but we'll put things into practice in the very next video.